Hey everyone, CoolKid here. I don't think it's a stretch to say that heat is one of Warframe's strongest status effects. Between its damage over time, unique consolidation mechanic, armor reduction, and even a brief stun through panic, it's got a lot going for it. On the more advanced end of things, heat also has access to heat inherit, a mechanic where certain properties of the initial heat source are carried into future heat procs. While this mechanic can be incredibly powerful if played into correctly, it can also be a huge detriment to the player, and paradoxically enough, Warframes that inflict heat damage often suffer from this problem the most. Now, if you watch my channel often, you already know how heat inherit works. I do still think it's important to explain this mechanic for the unfamiliar, however, so if you already know all this stuff, then feel free to jump to this timestamp. Still here? Alright, let's talk about how heat inherit actually works. So, generally speaking, procs of any given status effect are independent from other procs, including ones of the same type. For example, if I inflict an electric proc, and then I inflict another electric proc 3 seconds later, the first electric proc is entirely unaffected. It will deal its damage and run out its timer completely independently of the second electric proc, and likewise, the second electric proc is not influenced by the presence of the first electric proc. Heat bucks this trend though, having a unique consolidation mechanic where all heat procs combine into one damage instance. This means that all present heat procs deal damage together at the same 1 second interval, and new heat procs will add to this collective damage. On top of that, new heat procs will refresh the duration of all existing heat stacks, meaning that inflicting a new heat proc will set all present heat procs back to their full duration. With that explained, let's talk about damage over time math. I know, this stuff is scary, but I promise it's not difficult. So, when calculating the damage that a DOT will deal per tick, the game first calculates the hit's modded base damage. This value is the weapon's base damage after base damage mods and faction damage mods have been applied. This value is then run through another formula, where it's first cut in half before being multiplied by things like status damage mods, matching elemental mods, and faction damage mods again. Side note, if you've ever heard the term double dipping when it comes to faction damage mods, it's because they appear first in the modded base damage formula and then again in the DOT formula, so their bonuses are counted twice. There's also a section for additional multipliers, which includes things like critical hits, headshots, and so on. So, for example, if we use the following build on Bratton and inflict a heat proc, we'll first calculate the modded base damage, and then we'll run it through the DOT formula to get our damage per tick. Note that the in-game numbers can be a little off due to rounding and the like, but this formula is generally pretty accurate up until very large numbers are involved. So now that we've explained the math, where does heat inherit come into play? Well, heat inherit is a mechanic that causes certain parts of this formula to remain constant even if future heat stacks have different values. In particular, the elemental and faction damage multipliers from the first heat stack are inherited by all future heat stacks, instead of being rolled separately. To explain what I mean, let's do an example. Say I inflict a heat proc using a secondary with Hornet Strike, Primed Expel Grineer, and Primed Heated Charge, which makes our formula look like this. Now let's swap to our primary, which has base damage, status damage, and let's also say it gets a crit. If we inflict a heat proc with this weapon, the modded base damage, status damage, and additional multipliers will all be calculated, but the heat and faction damage will not be re-rolled. Instead, the resulting heat proc will inherit the faction and heat damage bonuses from the first stack of heat, which frees our mod slots up for other stats. It's worth mentioning that status duration is inherited from the first heat stack as well, as is the source of the heat proc. The heat proc source thing is kind of out of the scope of this video, but it can let you do some cool stuff, like generating Overguard with Blaze Artillery if a secondary with Fortifier inflicted the first heat stack. When leaned into, heat inherit is an incredibly powerful mechanic. You can use a priming weapon to stack up huge faction and heat damage bonuses, and then switch to a damage weapon that's juiced with stats that aren't inherited, like crit and status damage. When used with intentionality, heat procs are some of the highest damage status effects in the game, and they make short work of almost any enemy. So where's the problem here? Well, some of you might have pieced it together already, but for those of you who haven't, if the first stack of heat doesn't have any heat or faction damage bonuses, then no additional stacks of heat can have them either. This means that it's extremely easy to screw yourself out of a lot of damage if you don't know about this unexplained and unintuitive mechanic. Even worse, several Warframes are designed in such a way that they do it to themselves constantly. Take, for example, Ember. Ember's Fire Blast lets out a ring that armor strips enemies in a large radius while also lighting them on fire, so naturally, you'd want to cast it before you start dealing the bulk of your damage, right? Or what about Inferno, which can be used with Exothermic to make enemies drop energy orbs? Well, if you use these abilities before inflicting heat with another source, you have now gimped all future heat procs on affected enemies until the ability's proc expires. Ember's abilities have no heat or faction damage bonuses tied to them, which means that until those initial procs go away, no future heat procs can have those bonuses either. Not only does this mean that Ember won't get any benefit from any faction or heat mods on her weapons, in terms of DOT damage at least, but it also means that Ember won't find much value in her own Fireball Frenzy augment. For those who don't know, Fireball Frenzy is treated like a non-combining heat mod, and it slots into the matching elemental mod part of the DOT formula. This means that, if Ember imbues her weapons with Fireball Frenzy, and then armor strips enemies with Fire Blast before attacking them, the DOT damage benefit of Fireball Frenzy is completely nullified. As a side-by-side comparison, here's the damage ideal if I proc the enemy with my weapon first, and here's the damage if I proc the enemy with Fire Blast first. The worst part of this is that using Ember's abilities before you try to actually kill an enemy is completely reasonable. Enemies with no armor take 10 times more damage, implying they were at the armor cap, and Exothermic is a very useful augment for generating energy. But if you're using these abilities before you inflict a heat proc from your Fireball Frenzy infused weapons, then Fireball Frenzy only serves to increase your heat proc weighting, not your DOT damage. This is not only incredibly backwards, but also borderline impossible to intuit, which is really bad. Temple is another example of this phenomenon, as they have an incredibly powerful heat bonus in Ripper's Wail, which grants up to 750% more heat damage. Like Fireball Frenzy, this damage is additive with heat damage mods, and as such, it slots into the matching elemental bonus part of the formula. The thing is, Temple also has Pyrotechnics, which inflicts a forced heat proc on enemies it hits. This means that, if you're using Pyrotechnics on enemies before you shoot or melee them, then the damage bonus from Ripper's Wail no longer boosts future heat procs. Now, in fairness, you can cause Pyrotechnics to inherit the modifiers from weapon attacks if you use it after inflicting the first proc with a weapon. I think that this is certainly more reasonable than Ember's case, as Pyrotechnics mainly serves as a damage source, but it's still extremely unintuitive. Most players don't even know that this mechanic exists, let alone that their cast order is massively lowering their damage. The last frame I want to talk about is Uriel, who is in a bit of a weird spot with this stuff. You see, Uriel has a lot of abilities that inflict the heat status. Infernalis inflicts heat procs on enemies just for being near Uriel, Demonium's orbs can inflict heat procs while Infernalis is active, and Brimstone inflicts heat procs as it cooks the entire tile set. Like other Warframes, these abilities have no heat or faction damage modifiers, meaning that they weaken all future heat procs if used first. This isn't really an issue for Brimstone as it's so powerful, but it absolutely is an issue for Infernalis and Demonium. Infernalis ignites enemies just for being near you, meaning that it's almost always the first source of heat in a close quarters environment, especially if you're relying on your melee. On top of that, the Infernalis aura is also given to Uriel's demons while active, extending its effective range. Even worse, Gulfagor will rush down targets to latch them, rapidly stacking heat procs from Infernalis on enemies near him. Because Gulfagor prioritizes heavy targets, this means that he can nerf your damage against the enemies that need the extra damage bonus the most. Enemies killed while Gulfagor is latched will spawn a circle of pain that also inflicts heat procs, and again, these heat procs have no heat or faction damage modifiers. This means that, not only is he inflicting these limp-wristed heat procs while latching an enemy, but he also leaves behind a puddle of this stuff as well. Moving on to Demonium, its orbs inflict enemies with a damage vulnerability debuff, so it makes sense that you'd want to use them on enemies before attacking them. But again, if you do this, then future heat procs will have no heat or faction damage bonuses, which is a big loss in damage. Now, in fairness, Demonium only inflicts heat procs if Infernalis is active, so you can deliberately avoid Infernalis to prevent this from happening. But at the same time, I feel like it's pretty shitty that one of Uriel's most fun abilities can consistently and substantially hurt his damage, and most Uriel players are going to have it active at all times for its dodge effect. At face value, Infernalis is a cool and helpful ability, but because of Heat Inherit, it can be surprisingly harmful a lot of the time. Now, why did I say that Uriel is in a weird spot with this mechanic? Well, that's because Uriel's Demonium runes grant him Heat Elemental ammo, which isn't the same as Fireball Frenzy and Ripper's Wail. You see, instead of being treated as a non-combining elemental mod, Elemental Ammo instead inflicts an extra damage instance that deals a percentage of the main hit's total damage. So, for example, if I hit an enemy for 100 damage, and Demonium is at its base strength of 30%, then it will inflict a separate instance of damage that deals 30 heat damage. This extra instance also forces a heat proc, which uses the damage of Demonium's extra damage instance as its modded base damage in its formula. So in this example, the 30 Demonium damage is cut in half to 15, and if we have no other mods that affect the heat proc, that'll be the damage that we deal per tick. This means that Demonium runes aren't necessarily screwed over by Infernalis, as they primarily scale based on total weapon damage. The thing is, the heat procs from Demonium's heat ammo do still take elemental and faction damage mods into account. On top of that, because the initial Demonium hit is a percentage of the main hit's total damage, it double dips with elemental mods. To explain what I mean, if I have a weapon that deals 100 damage, and then I add on a heat mod for 90 more damage, my total damage is now 190. This means that the Demonium hit is now 30% of 190, which is 57, and that's our new modded base damage for the formula. On top of that, the DOT formula will count the heat mod again in the matching elemental mod part of the formula, so the bonus of said heat mod is applied twice. Faction mods are in even better standing, as not only do they affect the total damage of the hit that procs Demonium's damage instance, but for some reason, Demonium's damage instance itself will multiply its damage by the faction mod, meaning that it double dips. After that, it will then use the mod again when calculating the DOT damage, meaning that elemental ammo triple dips with faction damage mods. Side note, this is how all sources of elemental ammo work, including things like Silken Stride and Resupply. Weirdly enough, Saren's Toxic Lash also works this way despite not being elemental ammo, but that's kind of a footnote. With that established, if a heat proc is inflicted by Infernalis, then the elemental ammo will benefit from heat and faction mods the first time for the total damage, and it will count faction mods the second time on the hit itself, but the DOT formula will not count either kind of mod. This means that, strangely enough, building into faction damage mods is still useful, but not as much as it should be, and building into heat mods is often unnecessary. Why is that? Well, because the secondary damage instance is based on the main hit's total damage, elemental mods that aren't heat still contribute to Demonium's proc damage. This means that it's often more worthwhile to take non-heat mods for utility elements, like Viral and Corrosive, as they'll still boost Demonium's damage. So, again, despite being a heat-focused Warframe, building into heat on Uriel is actually not that helpful. I know, this is all really confusing, but I hope my explanations have made some sense. The last frame I want to highlight is Nezha, as he is hurt by this mechanic hard, but he's also able to pretty easily ignore it. Both Firewalker and Blazing Chakram inflict heat procs, and like all the other abilities that I've talked about, they have no heat or faction damage modifiers. This means that, if Nezha is using his first ability, he is leaving a giant trail of potential damage nerf in his wake. At that point, it's almost impossible to keep enemies from coming into contact with the heat procs, which is just a huge pain in the ass. Blazing Chakram inflicts both a damage vulnerability debuff and an increased orb drop chance, so logically, it would make sense to hit enemies with it before you light them up with your weapons. But again, because this ability inflicts a heat proc, no future heat sources will have their heat and faction damage bonuses considered, which can be a major damage loss. The big thing Nezha has going for him is that, unlike the prior Warframes, he doesn't have any kind of heat damage boost built into his kit. This means that he can build into other DOTs, like Gas, Electric, or Toxin, and be entirely unaffected by Heat Inherit neutering his damage. At the same time though, it's still unintuitive that a frame with all this heat damage would not want to build into heat, and I imagine that many Nezhas have no idea that they even need to be thinking about this. Now, these 4 frames suffer a lot from this problem, but I do want to play a bit of devil's advocate here. If you know about Heat Inherit, you can turn it to your advantage by inflicting heat procs with your weapons first. This means that future ability casts will inherit the heat and faction damage bonuses from your weapons, boosting their damage. This can be done with priming weapons like Compresso or Epitaph, or even with a companion running a primer like Tazakor. This lets the player turn things around, leveraging Heat Inherit as a damage boost instead of a damage loss. Sure, it's unintuitive, inconsistent, and not explained anywhere in-game, but it can be done, and it is very powerful. Except, there's one tiny problem here. Just because you know about Heat Inherit, that doesn't mean that your teammates do. I normally play solo, so this has been from a largely solo perspective thus far. However, in a squad, other players can easily screw you out of a lot of heat damage by inflicting subpar procs of their own. Heat is a very popular element on account of all of its prior stated benefits, but if a teammate uses it with lower faction or heat bonuses than you do, they'll hurt your damage. Even worse, if any teammates are playing Ember, Temple, Uriel, or Nezha, it is extremely likely that they are going to cripple not just your own heat damage boosts, but the heat damage boosts that they themselves provide you. Well, except for Nezha, I guess, and Uriel only kind of, that's besides the point. While these 4 frames are the most affected by this issue, they also aren't necessarily the only ones. Chroma, Gauss, Kome, Protea, any frame who inflicts heat procs with their abilities can easily create this scenario. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that, yes, you can tailor your build to work around this mechanic, even if you're playing a frame like Ember who is normally hurt by it. But if you have a teammate who doesn't know about Heat Inherit, they are probably going to actively harm your damage, and it is overwhelmingly likely that they don't even know they're doing it. I highlight all of this stuff to show just how easy it is to screw over your own damage, how easy it is to screw over your teammates' damage, and how unclear it is that it's even happening in the first place. Even if this problem is pretty limited in scope, I do think it deserves to be addressed, as the loss in damage can be massive. This is especially bad when things like Fireball Frenzy and Ripper's Wail come into play, and it's kind of paradoxical that frames like Ember and Temple can so easily rob themselves of their own damage boosts. I've seen many people suggest removing Heat Inherit altogether to fix this issue, and that would fix it, but it would also remove Inherit strategies used in other contexts. It would fix the issue for heat-inflicting Warframes, but it would also remove all Inherit-focused strats, which I don't think is a great solution. Sure, not many players utilize this mechanic in a way that's beneficial to them, but those that do don't deserve to have their loadouts ruined. So, my proposed solution is this. Instead of the heat and faction damage modifiers being inherited from the first source of heat, they should instead be inherited from the highest source that enters the stack. To explain what I mean, let's do another example. Let's say that we inflict a heat proc with a secondary like before, but this time we don't use Primed Expel Grineer, which makes our math look like this. Now let's inflict a heat proc from our primary, which has the same build as before, but this time it's the weapon with the Bane mod. When calculating the heat proc's damage per tick, the game won't reroll the heat damage bonus as the secondaries is higher, but it will reroll the faction damage bonus as the primaries is higher. Furthermore, if we then inflict another heat proc from our secondary, that heat proc will now benefit from the primary's faction damage bonus, as it's the new baseline for the stack. I think that this solution is the best of both worlds. It prevents Heat Inherit from neutering future heat stacks, but it also keeps the mechanic intact for those who like playing around it. Some people might argue that this is kind of overpowered, but this is Warframe. You can kill Steel Path level enemies with slide kicks. If anything, this should make frames like Ember, Temple, Uriel, and Nezha feel a lot better to play, while also preserving the mechanic for those who like using a primer and damage weapon combo at higher levels. Alright, that's all I wanted to say for this video. You can like and sub and all that, but before we go, I do want to state a few disclaimers. For one, I am not trying to say that I am more qualified than the developers when it comes to the topic of game balance. They've been making the game without my input perfectly fine for the last 13 years, so I don't really think they need my help. Even so, I want to share my feedback as a long-time player, and I hope that my arguments came across as both constructive and worth considering. 2. The goal of this video is not to bash or belittle the developers in any way. I am not trying to dunk on anybody, or paint DE as incompetent, or anything like that. To that end, I would like to ask that any discussion in the comments also refrains from toxic behavior. Feedback and criticism are at their most useful when they're delivered without cynicism and vitriol, so please be civil. With that stuff out of the way, thank you very much for watching. Thank you to my channel members for funding this content, and I'll see you next time.